Posso cominciare? Va bene, buongiorno, benvenuti a tutti, grazie per essere venuti a questo primo incontro di questo ciclo di lezioni che terremo questa settimana. Qualche breve presentazione, diciamo una breve presentazione dell'iniziativa e dei relatori, che è un tentativo, diciamo, di rinforzare le collaborazioni internazionali dell'istituto, che hanno una grande tradizione alle spalle, che in qualche modo vogliono cercare di aprirsi a nuovi scambi con altre università. In questo caso l'idea, l'opportunità era quella di cercare di unire le forze tra appunto l'istituto e l'Università di Utrecht, dove c'è una tradizione di studi e sulla filosofia tedesca e sull'orientalistica che in qualche modo si interseca bene con i programmi dell'istituto di quest'anno, e quindi parlando con Fioriglia siamo stati contenti di provare a presentare questo progetto, uno dei primi tentativi, tra l'altro non esplicitamente in italiano, credo di ricordare bene, sì, degli ultimi anni, quindi anche questo è importante. Va bene, quindi questa è l'idea di base, no? Cercare di inaugurare una serie di collaborazioni internazionali con alcune università del nord Europa, in particolare in questo caso specifico Utrecht, dove appunto c'è questa tradizione di studi abbastanza radicata. Più specificamente l'idea era quella di cercare di affrontare un tema che è importante da tutti i punti di vista, che poi appunto è un tema di cui voi vi occuperete a lungo quest'anno, che è quello della relazione, appunto, questo schema di categorie desueto no, lo decideremo in questi giorni, tra Oriente e Occidente, se abbia ancora senso, cosa significhi, quale sia la sua importanza. È un tema naturalmente che può essere declinato da tanti punti di vista. In questo caso specifico l'idea era quello di affrontarlo da un punto di vista più propriamente storico e filosofico, ma anche di storia intellettuale, perché qui appunto una breve presentazione dei relatori uniamo competenze diverse, perché da un lato abbiamo appunto il primo relatore di oggi, che è Paul Ziche, sempre dell'Università di Utrecht, che è uno specialista di Schelling, della filosofia tedesca hegeliana e post-hegeliana, delle relazioni tra filosofia e storia della scienza o relazioni tra filosofia e altre discipline, diciamo nel lungo Ottocento tedesco, che affronterà il tema della relazione tra Oriente e Occidente, diciamo, poi magari precisiamo meglio cosa intendiamo, a partire da Schelling in relazione tra l'opposizione tra mythos e logos. Domani avremo un altro collega da Utrecht, Christian Lange, che è professore appunto di Islamic Studies, studi islamici, un esperto, oltre che fresco vincitore di un altro importante progetto, NWO questa volta, sì, dopo aver avuto l'IRC qualche anno fa, in cui affronteremo questo problema da una prospettiva diversa. Se oggi affrontiamo il problema a partire dalla filosofia tedesca, quindi da Schelling in particolare, domani vediamo questo problema di cui parleremo a partire, diciamo, dall'altro lato della barricata, andando a indagare, come dire, la percezione di questa presunta opposizione, di quello che è in gioco in questa presunta opposizione tra Oriente e Occidente, da parte del mondo islamico, del mondo arabo, sempre del XIX secolo, se non ricordo male. L'ultimo giorno parlerò io, sono Mauro Bonazzi, sempre dell'Università di Utrecht, in cui, come dire, tornerò su alcuni dei temi da una prospettiva diversa. Non sarà più l'Ottocento, ma passeremo al Novecento, e in qualche modo affronterò questa opposizione dal punto di vista di una serie di autori che, come dire, pensavano di aver felicemente superato l'opposizione, nel senso che, pur appartenendo a un contesto che potrebbe essere velatamente considerato orientale, per loro non lo erano, nel senso che erano ebrei vissuti in Germania, felici di essere tedeschi e convinti di appartenere al mondo europeo, che un bel giorno, negli anni 30 del Novecento, scoprono che essendo ebrei loro non fanno parte dell'Europa, perché appunto fanno parte di questo mondo orientale che si sta cercando di eliminare, e sono costretti, come dire, a ripensare cosa vuol dire l'Europa, cosa vuol dire la relazione tra Atene e Gerusalemme. Quelle che sembravano parole con l'esilio diventano problemi drammatici, quindi diciamo una specie di approccio ancora diverso. Questa era l'idea. L'idea sostanzialmente è quella appunto di discutere, ma anche mettere in discussione la validità di questo schema, di questa opposizione tra Oriente e Occidente, e soprattutto di quello che significa. Appunto il tema di fondo è quello, diciamo, l'opposizione di fondo tra Oriente e Occidente sostanzialmente si sostanzia a partire dall'idea di un'opposizione tra, da una parte, la tradizione europea, la tradizione occidentale, che ha fatto della ragione, qualunque cosa essa significhi, il lume, il punto di riferimento, la guida che in qualche modo ha permesso a questa civiltà occidentale di svilupparsi, E dall'altra parte non si capisce mai bene cosa ci sia, dall'altra parte c'è quello che non c'è, quello che non è l'Europa, quello che non è l'Occidente. E invece appunto questa posizione è chiaramente, quindi infatti il titolo era and the other, perché appunto è un concetto in negativo, un concetto che viene definito in negativo, no? Quello che non è europeo è l'altro, quindi se non è razionale sarà irrazionale, e dobbiamo vedere cosa vuol dire irrazionale in quel contesto, eccetera, eccetera. L'idea è quella di metterlo in discussione perché chiaramente è una costruzione ideologica che ci aiuta a capire tanto, ma che appunto va messa in discussione proprio nelle sue pretese oggettività, visto che qua di oggettivo non c'è niente, e lo faremo appunto oggi con il primo relatore Paolo Ziche, a partire dal tema appunto della posizione tra mito e logos, che è il tema fondante ed è uno dei punti di riflessione fondamentali di Schelling, che è l'autore di cui parliamo oggi, e poi domani e dopo vedremo meglio nel dettaglio cosa faremo. Allora, ho già parlato troppo, quindi qualche parola per introdurre Paolo Ziche, ma ve l'ho già introdotto prima, è professore di filosofia moderna all'Università di Utrecht, è un grande specialista di Schelling, curatore di diverse opere di Schelling, è un grande studioso in generale della filosofia tedesca dell'Ottocento, in particolare la tradizione dell'idealismo tedesco, e anche, diciamo, i suoi ultimi progetti di ricerca sono piuttosto nella relazione, l'interazione tra la filosofia e le altre discipline, qualunque tipo di disciplina, si tratti della storia della scienza, quindi la nozione di come si sviluppano i concetti, ad esempio di empirismo, razionalismo, tutte queste categorie che ci sembrano scontate, che in realtà hanno sempre alle spalle una storia, oppure anche tradizioni, questo è un aspetto, come dire, anche più affascinante della sua ricerca, le relazioni tra cosiddette discipline che neanche considereremmo scientifiche come l'esoterismo, eccetera, invece nelle sue relazioni con la filosofia e quindi tutto quello che comporta questa contaminazione. Ma appunto ho già parlato troppo, quindi sono contento di dare la parola a Paul, che parlerà in inglese, ma vi ha già dato un testo che in qualche modo vi guida nell'ascolto. Poi in realtà sia Paul che Christian parlano tutte e due un tedesco ottimo perché sono tedeschi, ma anche l'olandese parlano se volete, ma soprattutto penso che in italiano più o meno capiscano e in realtà parlano, perché lui è già amico di mezza Napoli a quanto ho capito. Quindi se volete potete anche fare le domande in italiano se vi sentite più tranquille, poi io posso intervenire. Va bene, allora Paolo, prego, ti do la parola. Lui nella migliore tradizione olandese non si siede come hanno fatto tutti i relatori dell'istituto fino ad oggi, ma sta qua. Aspetta che ti do un po' d'acqua.
Mauro, grazie molto. Thanks to all of you for coming. Also thanks that I may address you in English, which is easier than addressing you in Italian for me. It's a mythical place for me to be here, because in my student days, some 35 years ago, l'Istituto Italiano e l'Avvocato Marotta have been extremely important for everyone studying Schelling and Hegel in Germany. So it's a particularly great pleasure for me to be here today and to address you on a topic that I can best introduce by saying that I'm not really talking about the topic I'm supposed to talk about at all, but I still think that something very interesting can be learned from the fact that I'm not going to talk about the topic at all. I want to show you some of the ways how Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, one of the most important philosophers thinking about the history of mythology and of mythologies, including what we today might call Eastern mythologies, I'll say a bit more about that in a second, into a gigantic philosophical project. So that's only half of Schelling's philosophy of mythology, at which he's been working late in his life. Never published it himself, so it's published by his son on the basis of manuscripts left over from his father. And again, these two huge volumes are only the first half of an even larger 4-volume project that culminates in a philosophy of revealed religion. So even given that context, it is one of the most extensive philosophical projects thinking about mythology. And of course, he is discussing with a lot of sources and very well informed about the available expertise at his times about Chinese, Indian, Egyptian, Persian, Zabist, and quite some other Eastern mythologies. But what he's not doing, and that's what I find more fascinating, is giving us a history that we might call a reception history, where older forms of mythologies are taken up, transformed, adapted, criticized by later thinkers or later forms of mythology. And he's also, and that might be a controversial claim, but I'm making it anyway, not thinking in terms of a clear teleological history, starting from simple or perhaps even primitive, irrational, mythical, earlier forms of thinking that then have gradually been transformed into European rationalist thinking. And given the kind of stereotype image we sometimes get of European rationality being a way of criticizing, conquering, colonizing earlier forms of rationality, I do find the strategy of his interesting. And in a way, I'm not going to talk that much about Eastern mythologies, but about ways of coming up with a framework of thinking about different mythological, and Schelling is explicit, not saying religious, but mythological frameworks in a way that integrates all of them without teleologically telling a story that culminates with the Greeks or with European rationality. Originally I wanted to tell you how he's thought about these Eastern mythologies, but I'm moving more and more away from this topic, and this will also be invisible in what I'm going to tell you today. Just some outline remarks about his philosophy of mythology project, which is huge in scope. It consists of 22 lectures of about 20 pages each in the printed version devoted to mythology, preceded by 3 introductions, or maybe 2, depends on how you count, which already shows that the systematic structure is problematical. A first introduction deals with the historical critical methodology as applied to mythology, and clearly places what he does in the scholarly context of his times. The second introduction, much longer, deals with the ultimate form of presenting philosophy as a rational endeavor. And that's only a preparation for then going into mythology, which itself starts with an introduction, and that's a discourse on monotheism. So, of course, we do tend to think that mythologies typically are polytheistic endeavors, but for Schelling, the basic pattern behind it is that we first need to start with a notion of God in general, without further diversification and discussion. Indeed, for him, there never has been a period in which appeared in human history without an idea of God. That's pretty natural because, according to him, and I'm not going into these arguments, historicity in general starts with an idea of a divine being. So in this sense, it's a tautology to say that there has been no period in history without an idea of a divine being, because history starts with this idea. And of course, we may see that reflected in mythological or religious ideas in the fact that a Genesis story is important in all these mythologies. Okay, so we start with an original idea of monotheism, which then unfolds into a number of forms of polytheistic mythologies, which then find their final form, and that is a kind of teleological structure in the system of Greek mythology. But we need to add directly that Greek mythology clearly is not a unified system. There are a number of epochs that he also clearly distinguishes, with Kronos and Uranos and Zeus at the end. And all of these periods are related, and Greek mythology in his presentation becomes interwoven with all sorts of other mythologies. Okay, until then, of course, the next step is going to follow, which I'm also not going to discuss today, and that's a step, again, back from polytheistic Greek mythology into revealed monotheistic Christian religion. So you can think of it in terms of a kind of Hegelian three-step procedure, but I'm not really not going into these final steps at all. The scope of his methodological project is enormous. He discusses a large number of mythologies, and I refer to some of them. In other texts, he's also going into archaeological evidence, in particular a text on the deities of Samothrake. He's discussing philological details, doing creative, daring, probably completely false philological emendations of the Homeric hymn texts, using primary and secondary sources in modern languages, but also sources in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and Syrian in his reconstructions. What's interesting, and I have already mentioned that as the driving force behind what I want to tell, is the attitude of his endeavor. There have been extremely erudite projects in discussing mythology, also extremely elaborate handbooks for mythology, but still many of these books do tell a story that very clearly culminates with the Greeks. Friedrich Kreuzer's Symbolik und Mythologie der alten Völker is an interesting case in question, where Kreutzer says that he refers to the Orient throughout his book, gives a lot of information, but still claims that the Greeks are the mother of mythology, which is a strange kind of idea because clearly they come pretty late in the history of mythology. So what kind of relationship does he have in mind here? We might say that it's precisely this kind of question that Schelling takes up in his narrative, which is extremely labyrinthic indeed. A couple of key issues that need to be kept in mind. Historicity is a key motive for Schelling. I have already referred to his idea that having a history starts with having an idea of a divine being. This, for him, also is the starting point at which human society organizes itself in the form of states or nations or societies or peoples. Normally in German he would use the term Völker. So the idea that there is a particular concept that makes it possible for groups of humans to organize themselves around this concept. Historicity is also important for him because we can understand something that is real only once we have understood how it came about, what kind of processes were responsible for it being as it is. This clearly makes it difficult to think about a starting point of such a narrative, and the fact that he accumulates more and more introductions shows how difficult it is for him to actually get his project going. That again is a problem we know from Hegel. Either we have already available at the beginning what we are then going to discuss, but then we don't have a real starting point, or we need to explain a radical step into something which is completely different, which is also difficult to reconstruct in historical terms. Schelling is sort of evading this problem and starts, and I'll show you in a second how he does so, with a first form of mythology which is precisely at the tipping point between a prehistorical, pre-organized state of humankind into an organized polytheistic system. What's important for him, and that's why it's so important for him to have all these mythologies presented within one project, is that the history of mythology and mythologies, in the end, can only be understood in its totality. It's not a history where at each and every moment I have precisely one mythology and then I can leave it behind and move on to another one. It is, in a sense, that's even stronger totalitarian, you might say, than Hegel, only the entire history that has to be kept present simultaneously in mind that can help us understand mythology, the phenomenon of mythology in general. Why is it important at all to understand mythology? Of course, being in a place where you have ancient history throughout inscribed into art history, into objects, into the structure of the city, that might seem self-evident, Schelling has another and even stronger argument. If it's so important to reconstruct historical processes of genesis, that not only applies to mythologies. In fact, this applies to every kind of epistemological attempt we may make at all. Whenever we want to understand anything, we need to understand it in terms of its historicity. And we always need to understand historicity, genesis, coming about, originating in something which originally is not quite what we get at the end. These structures we need to take to be central in every human cognitive endeavor. Again, in a phrase that sounds Hegelian, but that we also find in Schelling, this is the structure of human consciousness. And I'll return to that later in my presentation. Now, if that is the case, then every study of mythology needs to be a preeminently rational endeavor. Then I cannot say I'm first looking into mythology as a primitive form of human world contact or as an emotional literary endeavor. Then the study of the history of mythology is a way of understanding human rationality in general, and that also means that mythology should be rational throughout. And Schelling has a nice phrase for that, to which I will return. Mythology needs to be understood in its own right, or it needs to be able to explain itself. It shouldn't just be us later interpreters who can make sense of mythology by hindsight, by where it led to, or by interpreting it, for instance, in allegorical terms. It should be a completely transparent and self-evident story that we get when looking at mythology. Now that also looks strange if we think about the complicated structure, the sometimes not quite logically coherent or morally coherent mythological stories we get. Still, it should be a completely transparent and self-evident story, at least in the sense of it should be self-evident to the extent at which human cognition is ever self-evident and transparent. So this already leaves open, and we return to that at the end, an interesting strategy. If we think that mythology is not completely coherent and transparent, then we might also come to draw the conclusion that human consciousness shouldn't be completely self-evident and transparent in the end. So all of these are, I think, interesting and sufficient motivations to look into the way how Schelling discusses the history of mythologies, and in particular also which place he gives to Eastern mythologies in a story which, of course, and that's so natural to him that he doesn't really question it, ends with the Greeks, but in a way that's far more complicated than one might traditionally assume. The philosophical systematical issue that we need to look into is whether in telling his story the way he does, he can arrive at concepts, arguments, analytical categories that are sufficiently rich to really make it possible to view this large history as an integrated account from which we can learn something for the way how human rationality can function. So, first step, Schelling on Eastern mythologies. It's interesting to see that Schelling is pretty reluctant to lump together several mythologies under one overarching term. He does so to some extent when talking about Egyptian or Indian mythology, which in themselves are diverse. but he doesn't frequently use a label such as Eastern mythologies. So that already is a kind of what you may call liberating democratic approach. He's not thinking in terms of a polarized opposition between Western ways of thinking and the East. Let's first look at the most important steps he takes in looking at these mythologies. He starts with something Christian I already talked about very briefly at the beginning, a kind of mythology, and you might always say between bracket religion, but for him it's not really a religion, because a religion requires the binding force of a revealed religion in modern Christian terms, is what he calls Zabism. I don't even know whether that's the proper English term. That's a form of religion, mythology, that's pretty dubious for modern historians of religion, but which he finds important. What he finds here is, and we can question whether that's historically adequate, but that's not something where I can really enter the discussion. It's an astral religion, a religion where stars are worshipped. In an interesting shift of perspectives for Schelling, it's not that the gods simply are the stars, or the stars are gods. That would already presuppose that we have many gods. He rephrases this idea by stating what happens here is that the older idea of a divine being, which has been unreflected and unstructured, this one God is realized in the many stars that we see. That's already an interesting twist to the idea that gods are stars or stars are gods. It's of course also obvious that if you think that way, it's a pretty impoverished idea of divine individuality, because the stars aren't quite as individual as, say, the gods we know from Greek mythology or from Egyptian or what have you. But still, it's a first step towards a materialization of the divine idea, of giving the gods an independent reality, to think about gods and humans in terms of a consciousness here and externality, something external there pattern. Things go on. Zabism still wanted to have the gods remain spiritual, far away, unchanging, unerring in what they do. Basically, all homogeneous, all equal. The next step that he takes is a step into what he calls Persian mythology. And that's a moment in which the gods become discussed in terms of gendered beings. In particular, an original male principle, and that's a pretty patriarchal notion of male as being powerful, productive, becomes female. And we see a switch, and I'm always following him without critically questioning what he presents, towards mother figures as goddesses. And he has an entire range: Urania, Astarte, Milita. So we directly see that gods acquire a more richly textured structure. There's more diversity, more dynamics, and from now on we can start telling histories of divine interactions. Think in terms of family histories. We also see that gods themselves require, in his terms, control over processes of materialization. It's not just a consciousness here and objects out there, projective duality. It's the gods themselves becoming involved in processes of making themselves into individual and material beings. That then would be an origin of genuine polytheism. It's interesting to see, and there you already can detect traces of the structure, the strategy he uses for presenting his ideas, that it's never a clear-cut story. So we have these divine mother figures, but we also have the enigmatic figure of Mithras in Persian mythology. And of course we know Mithras also in many other contexts. We know it in Roman mythology. It's an interesting mediator between pagan, Eastern, Roman, and to some extent also Christian traditions. So one of the arguments why Mithras becomes so important for him is that as soon as we start thinking about divine beings as having their own history and family history, we require mediating figures. That's a very realistic account, you might say, of kinship relations and natural histories of beings. And Mithras typically is this kind of mediating figure. He also draws a parallel between Mithras and Buddha. So there's a link between Persian and Indian mythologies here. And you can also draw a parallel, and he also does that, between Mithras and Christ. The next step, very briefly, gets us into Phrygian mythology, where he emphasizes the orgiastic, ritualized, wild character of this mythology. You also see that there's a gap in the numbers of lectures he devotes to each, and the gap between Persian and Phrygian and Egyptian is filled with early steps of Greek mythology. So that's where Kronos and Uranos have their place. So you already see that the various stories are interwoven in the way how he presents it. Next step, Egyptian mythology. That clearly, again, is a polytheistic religion. It's a religion that, for him, steps over into what he calls a real or conscious monotheism again. So interestingly, he starts with reading Greek mythology as being organized by individual god figures who, in his analysis, bring together this large array of gods we find. In particular, he's fascinated by Osiris in this context. Another issue that he emphasizes is that there is an interesting moment of abstraction in Greek mythology, which we find in the fact that it's not that much about individuals anymore, which we see in the interesting human-animal mixtures that we come up in Greek mythology, and also in the fact that we have quite a large number of animal mummies left over, which cannot, so there's a wonderful crocodile in the Archaeological Museum in Naples. Now clearly this animal cannot be the object of worship itself, except if we take it as a representative of a type. So this interplay between concreteness and generality is something that is played out in quite some detail in Egyptian traditions. The next step, and you already see some patterns that return again and again, Indian mythology. That for him is the most extreme form of polytheism. Unity is maximally dissolved. I've been thinking quite a lot about why that should be the case. His argument is, and again I'm in no position to critically question his sources, that in Greek mythology, in Greek religious practice, we frequently find strong oppositions. And he thinks that there are groups who are worshipping Shiva and groups worshipping Vishnu, but always exclusively, bloodily fighting the other. So they are not coming to a richly structured system of mythological figures. They have got no real idea of plurality of figures coming together, but they're also unable to give the gods they worship the function of integrating, bringing together, mediating between mythological figures. So in his analysis, Brahma might be a divine being who could take up this function, but then he says, in fact, he doesn't really play an important role in Indian mythology at all. Final remark, very briefly, Chinese mythology, dealt with pretty extensively. And again, you see that the structure of his presentation is by no means linear. Because what he says when referring to Chinese mythology, which includes Confucius, Lao Tzu, strangely enough, people we would rather think of as individual philosophers, now dealt with together with the mythological figures in the other mythologies. China, for him, is still in a prehistorical state. It's not yet a nation state. It's far too diverse, little organized, to have come to the level of developed mythologies. One way of putting it is it's an astral religion which is turned into the principle of a state. So China is dealt with, but it doesn't quite fit his narrative if we think of the narrative as a linearly progressive narrative. It fits the patterns that he wants to discuss, however, and that's patterns in which the most important criterion for analyzing methodological ideas is the way how individuality and a system, and is using the notion of a system consciously and explicitly of individuals in their interaction, can be brought together. And I'm explicitly not saying harmonized, because it's not a harmonious process at all in many cases. You already see that there is a kind of self-applicability to this idea. So if we think of the cosmos of mythological figures in Greek tradition, that presents us with a problem of bringing together into some sort of framework a large number of individuals. And we see lots of difficulties, in particular the kind of difficulties I have already hinted at, for instance, difficulties in the temporal order of these mythological figures. But quite the same kind of problem we also encounter when we want to discuss the relationship between all the different mythologies that there are. And in a way, you might even say we return to this phrase from Kreutzer that I referred to earlier, that Greeks are the mother of mythologies, because that, strangely enough, would mean it's a kind of mother who comes at the beginning, but on the other hand is later than other forms of mythologies. How should we do that? But that's sort of precisely what we get in quite some of the methodological stories if we look in more detail. And that should be the next step that we need to look into. What kind of structures does Schelling find in the mythological stories he's interested in that support a pattern of thinking in which highly different, highly diverse, even inimical figures and ideas and systems of thought can come to some kind of coexistence? You might say that sounds like a kind of passivist form of harmonization. Probably is. It could also sound like a kind of postmodern destruction of the very idea of a system in general. So let's see how Schelling elaborates on this idea in some more detail. And now I'll refer mostly to what he does with Greek mythologies, because that clearly has the most detail in what he does, and that's also where he himself is the most expert in dealing with the sources, up to the level of tinkering with the sources when he's changing a phrase in Homer's hymn on Demeter to mean precisely the opposite of what we have in all the established textual traditions. What we find when we look at mythologies is that mythological figures and persons typically are what I have called uncertain persons. What do I mean by that? Look at an important episode in Greek mythology, such as the episode with Demeter in Persephone, Proserpina, and Dionysos. In an important book on Demeter and Persephone, Proserpina, the German historian of mythology, Ludwig Preller, called Demeter a mythological monstrum, a monstrous figure. And that comes because of the inexhaustible volubility of the Greek writers. So the Greek writers presenting completely unclear stories, combining without any clear strategy, apparently, myth and fables into an ever-growing thicket of varying stories. This author clearly is unhappy with the state that the mythological narratives are in. He wants to straighten things up, come up with clear accounts. Schelling's story could not be more different. For him, it's important to emphasize that mythological figures typically do not have a fixed position in terms of temporal sequence, in terms of kinship relations, in terms of periodization of the big steps in the history of mythology. Now we see that if we look at the Demeter-Persephone story in a number of ways. Persephone herself, of course, it's the key point about Persephone that she doesn't have a particular place in the world where she lives. She lives half the year underground and half of the year here in our world. So she oscillates between the two worlds, and in doing so, she can mediate between the two worlds. Things become even more difficult if we look at the relationship between Demeter, Ceres, and Persephone, Proserpina, the mother and the daughter. In looking at the sources, Schelling comes to see that Proserpina is nothing but Ceres. The daughter is nothing but the mother in a different form. And their names, as also their images, have been mixed up. That's not just a question of mixing up things. This also means that when Demeter is desperately, frantically searching for Proserpina throughout the world, she's in fact seeking herself, excited about having to miss herself and wanting to find herself back again. You can easily translate this into structures of consciousness. So when I'm wanting to understand something, I'm missing a key idea. Of course, what I'm going to search for is something which is part or going to be part of myself. Even Athena can be called, in a certain sense, as being Persephone yet again. So we get a huge mix-up of mythological figures, and that we find in a number of concrete cases and supported by a number of concrete arguments. Just to give you some of them, the names of the gods. Typically a huge problem in Greek mythology throughout, but also in other mythologies. So basically, most of what I say should also be applicable, at least in parts, to other mythologies. The uncertainty, a quote, of etymological explanations, in particular those of the names of gods, stems mainly from the fact that every god is capable of many and very different properties. The gods do not have a very clear profile in Greek mythology. The same holds for kinship relations. Several marriages, extramarital relationships, rape, confusions of that between mother and daughter are only too common in mythology. The gods can have very different functions simultaneously. So Persephone can be both the ruler of the underworld and the cherished and ever sought for daughter of Demeter, who's in charge of the fertile soil of this world. The individual gods and goddesses, and just giving you a number of examples for how things get unclear, can be located in different periods of mythological history. Demeter stands between the period of Kronos and that of Zeus. and perhaps most visibly remarkable, there are shifting boundaries between the genders or sexes too. Okay, the entire mythological process started by gods becoming female, but what we then see is all kinds of gender boundaries getting mixed up. Of course, Zeus is the father of Dionysos, but Zeus also nourishing little Dionysos in his thigh, to some extent also is the mother of Dionysos. Dionysos is often depicted as a kind of hermaphrodite being. Many other similar examples of all the traditional lines of demarcation, names, functions, gender, being systematically removed, or we might say, used as ways of systematically unclarifying the structure of mythological system, even in, and in particular, in the Greek mythology. For Schelling, that's interestingly a kind of achievement of Greek mythology, to make things less explicitly clear, to make things less locatable, to make it more difficult to pin down the position of an individual in the cosmos, but rather of thinking in terms of a continuously interwoven, interrelated system of persons with shifting boundaries everywhere. In these structures, then, it becomes possible for Schelling to understand very complex relations as nevertheless being instantiated in reality. So the kind of biologically impossible but mythologically perfectly plausible stories, these are ways of making our way of thinking about realities ever more complex. So we might also say, in a very simplified way, what Schelling is after is a ever more complicated structure of relationships that nevertheless can be presented in terms of narratives and stories. Interestingly, again, in the end of Greek mythology, for Schelling, it's important to look into the Eleusinian mysteries and to view the mysteries as the ultimate point of mythology. There are all sorts of links to Christian ideas, revelation of ultimate truth, resurrection, overcoming death. But again, I'm not referring to that here. What's important for me here is that the mysteries, and that's in particular the Eleusinian mysteries, you've been there just recently, you told me, are ways of dealing explicitly with the polyvalent identity of the mythological personae. He emphasizes in this context that even the mysteries are not getting us into forms of irrationalism. For us, being mystical has all sorts of negative anti-rational connotations for Schelling. It's the culmination of a process of showing that human life and human consciousness, human world interaction needs to be thought of in the kind of complexity that I've very briefly adumbrated by looking at the stories of Greek mythology. A final point before we can look into some pictures and illustrations, because mythology should also be made concrete. This point concerns epistemological notions. I have already emphasized that mythology should be transparent, should explain itself. Schelling takes over a term from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the beautiful term, mythology should be a tautegory. Of course, we are all acquainted with allegorical interpretations. Interpretation, something in terms of each other, interpreting something in terms of something else. That's literally what allegory says. saying something else or saying it differently. Tautogery is, okay, it's not quite the same as tautology, but not saying anything that is different from what we have here, just expressing or letting express itself what we have at hand. Part of how this should work out in the case of mythology is that mythology should contain its own history. And I have already given you ways of relating for instance, the kinship relations studied in mythology as a way of looking at the mythological project in general. This means, quote again, the quote is also on the handout, that the very same principles that take materially form its content are at the same time the formal causes of its formation and genesis. So this strongly supports the idea that if mythological history in its genetical sequence of steps is not a linear and teleological event, neither so is the form of consciousness that we need in dealing with mythology or in consciousness in general. Another important aspect of this idea is that reconstructing historical genesis or reconstructing processes in general requires us to engage with errors, with falsehoods, with wrong turns. And that we also see again in Greek mythology. It's not a straightforward story. Many things go wrong in this story, but we need to have an understanding of historical processes that can include these errors, falsehoods, wrong turns. Greek mythology, standing in the middle between past and future, allows the consciousness a completely free relationship to itself. And standing in a free, creative, productive relationship to oneself includes that we should not think only in terms of truth, only in terms of working towards one single goal. We need to be able to incorporate the kind of multiplicity and complexity that we find in the mythological stories. Now, at this point, it's very tempting indeed to look at illustrations. And we are blessed with the fact that we are able to see many more than Schelling ever have been. He's been giving a beautiful description of these statues from Aegina, now in Munich. And so that's what he does there is having a description by an art historian, Johann Martin Wagner, and adding comments. And he could do so because of his position at the Academy of the Sciences and Humanities in Munich, but you really see that he was extremely eager to comment upon statues and to deal with the real objects. Now, of course, here it's very tempting to go to the Museo Archeologico and look at some examples, and most of them on my handout are from the museum. So first thing to note is the multiple ways in which Dionysos is portrayed. Sometimes, just as in the second middle picture in the first row, as a kind of calm, focused, almost meditative figure. Interestingly, with the kind of dress that you normally rather would expect in female figures. You can also have on the left side this kind of, again, slightly dreamy, aloof head portrait. But of course you also have drunken Dionysos. Or you have the next one, the small bronze from Pompeii, Dionysos in this kind of very dancing, slightly hermaphrodite position. You also have Dionysos in Indian and Greek, Indian and Egyptian context. That's the next two illustrations. And Schelling refers to Dionysos throughout his philosophy of mythology. So that would be For anyone wanting to write a paper or a thesis, a great topic to reconstruct Schelling's philosophy of mythology based exclusively upon Dionysos. There's a Persian Dionysos and an Indian Dionysos. And so that's a figure who really links together all these strands in mythology. Another topic that could be addressed that's not that explicit, but at some points it is explicit in Schelling, is the way how animals and humanoid gods interact. So there are wonderful figures in the museum mixing up humans and animals. Clearly this boy with the dolphin. There also is a very nice photo from Pompeii pouring wine from a dolphin, which again is a kind of Dionysos iconography. You have a parallel figure of a satyr pouring wine from a flask. And the most fascinating probably is the Toro Farnese, which is all about literally tying up humans and animals in a very violent setting, but also, and you have Antiope walking behind this violent Dirke and the Toro, doesn't matter, figure sort of coming after as a kind of slightly isolated the animality of humanity transcending figure. You also have a wonderful mixing up statue which combines Fortuna, Isis, Demeter, and Faustina, the wife of Marcus Aurelius, into one statue with a complex story of renovations, but that's already ancient. Again, another Dionysos from a painting in Pompeii, Isis, and this wonderful statue of Artemis, again, which also takes up all sorts of Isis iconography. So if you have these ideas of uncertain personalities in your mind and walk through the archaeological museum, basically every object sort of confirms these ideas and points also to the omnipresence of Dionysiac figures and ideas throughout mythology. Let me come to some concluding remarks. That's precisely what Mauro asks for me, and I do so. Conclusion. Sorry? Okay. Schelling's project clearly is hugely ambitious, and the largest term he has for his project is at the beginning of the next volume, Philosophy of Revelation, where he talks about, I want to arrive at a form of world consciousness, Weltbewusstsein. What I find more and more fascinating about what he presents us with is an attitude which can combine hugely broad scope, which can be fully inclusive with respect to different mythologies, without assuming epistemological hierarchies and without arranging the different mythologies in the form of a linear series of steps or linear reception history. We might ask whether this also helps addressing present day issues. How can we adequately refer to other discursive frameworks without a form of appropriation? How can we do full justice to other positions while being firmly rooted within our own tradition? I find it really difficult to decide whether Schelling really can provide an adequate answer to these challenges, but in the first step we can and should, and that will be my last 2 minutes, collect some of the conceptual resources that he develops in order to address these problems. Some of you may know, Mauro certainly does, that I'm a great friend of small words. And there are some beautiful small words in Schelling's text which precisely point into the direction I've been referring to. One is the nice term of zergehen, which I would be hard-pressed to translate, dissolve. But it's a very particular kind of dissolving. It's the kind of dissolving that sugar does when you put it into a cup of coffee. Which is, it sounds almost like the German vergehen, disappear or wilt away, but is also a form of going over into. And all of these connotations come together. What we need to look into when we want to understand the relation between different mythologies is precisely this form of a zergehen, which he also translates as a kind of freely going over into the other forms. Which, interesting, and that's where the word doesn't quite work, should also be a back and forth process. Another beautiful term is that of Bewältigung, which might both mean an overcoming of earlier forms, but also a way of acquiring stable control or ways of living with the earlier forms. In German, we typically would use this term as overcoming or being able to live with a traumatic experience. That's the kind of attitude we need with respect to earlier forms of mythology. And if I were to give you a summary in 3 key phrases of the problems that Schelling wants to confront us with, you find them in the last point on the handout. What he does is studying mythology in a way that's not leading to a final result, but in a way that allows us to regain potentiality, to end up in a situation where we have more options for thought than in the beginning. It's a typical way of thinking about potentiality and actuality, to say that in the beginning something was only potentially there and then it became actual. He wants to inverse this pattern and tells us that being able to think in and with potentialities is an ultimate achievement of rationality. And we see that in mythology, in particular in all the difficulties we have with mythological stories. 2 other phrases which are related to that. One is we need an explanation of what is hidden. So we don't have to remove the hidden layers to clarify them, to rationalize them, but we need to understand their importance and functions. And that's perhaps the strongest summarizing term which takes up the potentiality issue, we need to understand the possibility of being different. So not coming up with a streamlined account, but explaining and understanding and making accessible a situation in which difference is not only possible but tolerated. And that sounds pretty much like a very modern kind of statement to make, but you can find it very explicitly and very elaborately presented when Schelling builds in Eastern mythologies into a story of mythology that, even if it ends with the Greeks, doesn't take them as the ultimate standard for how to assess the history of mythology. That's what I wanted to present to you. Thanks for listening.
Grazie. Possiamo subito domande, questioni sia specifiche rispetto al testo che in generale rispetto al problema, diciamo, del nostro incontro. Molti chiarimenti, in tutte le lingue che volete.
Tutte?
Molto.
Much of what you said much of the talk you gave is rather obscure to me. In particular, I don't understand this challenging analysis of mythologies, to what mythologies does applies. In the table there are only Eastern mythologies, but a big share of your talk was about Greek and Latin mythology. And so I have not been able to understand whether Schelling thinks there is a radical difference between Eastern and Western mythologies, or there is a unifying principle. It is my fault, but I could not touch this. And besides that, will not such an analysis apply also to the great religions, the monotheistic religion, to Christian and Islamic religions? Why not? I also have been rather upset about the Indian mythology and mixing, at least in the table, the classical Indian religion with Trimurti with Buddhism. In my view, is a completely different view. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That, of course, that's really good questions, and particularly the first one is a question I've also been very strongly struggling with. So there are extensive discussions of all these Eastern mythologies I've been referring to, and as I said, I'm not really able to assess to which extent they do justice even to the sources Schelling himself had available, or to the phenomena themselves. What's important for me, however, is, and that's in a way the way to answer your first question, yes, there are differences between these mythologies, but that's not what Schelling really is interested in. So he seems to be far more interested in showing that in everything we do as thinking beings, we need a framework of a complex framework of thought structures that makes it possible to bring together very different concrete phenomena or structures without losing the difference, but also without harmonizing or homogenizing them. And you might say it's a kind of pretty, now, why do I need to discuss the structure with respect to mythology? There could be many other ways of doing it. But it's interesting to see that Schelling does discuss it with respect to mythology. So he wants to present these mythologies also in terms of differences, but saying in the end, the differences, I had almost said they do not really matter. They do matter, but only in the sense of giving us an indication of the richness of the framework that we need. And the most important individual aspects of difference are the extent to which the different mythologies come up with a system of individual figures and their relationships. But then we see directly that this phrase again doesn't work, because not even the Greek mythological system is in any sense a system. It's not clearly organized. It's in terms of times, places, kinship relations. It's rather chaotic. So we could also say what Schelling invites us to consider is whether we shouldn't take this chaotic structure of relationships we find within mythology, within Greek mythology itself, but also if we compare the different mythologies to each other, as, okay, put it provocatively, as a form of definition of what a system of thoughts might look like. So I know that's an evasive answer, and also know that that's a kind of evasive talk that I gave, but the more and more you look into the way, or more you ask yourself, why does Schelling discuss these different mythologies at all? That seems to be the kind of strategy that's driving his project.
First of all, I would like to thank you, Paul Ziche, for this interesting lecture that show us how modern, let's say, the proposal of Schelling is. I have a couple of questions. First of all, which is the genealogy of this idea? I mean, how did Schelling came to this philosophy of mythology? The second one is, what is the significance of this position in the field, in the philosophical field of German idealism in general, and in Schelling's philosophy in particular? I know that is a big question, but just if it is possible, can you give us some suggestion about the Wirkungsgeschichte of Schelling's mythology? What is I know that it's very big, but you can just answer, just tell us something about it. What is more interesting for you? Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yes, that's huge questions, and I'm really interested to hear what Christian is going to say, because some aspects of Wirkungsgeschichte might return then. In terms of Schelling's own career, his first writings start with discussing mythology when he was a student at Tübingen, and there has been huge discussions as to the proper strategy for interpreting mythological texts. Of course, we all know about the 4 typical ways of interpreting biblical scripture texts, and one of the issues is whether we should use precisely these same strategies in order to analyze mythological texts. There also has been increasing awareness as to the precise source analysis and philological method. So that's what he addressed while still being a student, and that clearly comes from both being trained in ancient languages, and in particular Greek philosophical texts, and having a very strong exegetical Christian pietist background. And bringing these two together is a kind of original motivation. In his later project, that's relegated to a kind of small introduction into this project. So in this sense, it's still present. The really important point that is added in later Schelling, that's the second question you had, is a point that has to do with how we should understand reality. Okay, idealism should be about ideas, but idealism also should be able to provide us with a superior way of understanding reality. And then not only a reality that's a reality of ideas, but a reality that's out there independent of our thoughts and ideas. That could be a way of summarizing the project of late Schelling, and some implications of that are that indeed we should look more and more into history, because history, the way how something came about, is a way of understanding precisely the difficulty of getting hold of reality, in the sense of history needs to start from somewhere and leading into something else. But if it's a real historical process, we don't have full control about the starting point. And the starting point needs to be importantly different from anything that comes from it in order to give us any insights. Otherwise, it's always just the same. In the end, and that's something that's typically, that's a development having been going on from the late 1790s onwards, the paradigm for something being real in the sense of being beyond our control is divine genesis. So we can control a lot of things, but there's one thing we cannot control, and that's the fact that God created the world. So if you combine these two lines, three lines, an interest in reality, an interest in historicity, and an interest in those processes or moments that are beyond our control. That's the project of the large shelling, and to this project, what he does with mythology is an introduction. So it's clearly about processes. It's about processes that are beyond our control in the sense of defying all kinds of traditional structures, linear sequence, logical ordering, clear functions, what have you. But precisely by being that, they acquire the status of, what you might say, a criterion for what it means for something to be real. Things need to be at least as complex and intransparent, opaque, violent, illogical as the mythological stories in order to be real. The big challenge then, of course, is to carry this kind of analysis into an analysis of Christian religion, which, if I'm right in what I'm saying, should be even more complex, illogical, rich, difficult to pin down than what we've learned in mythology. Kreutzer is thanking Schelling a lot in the introduction to his book. That's from 1819, I think. So Schelling has been perceived as an important figure in thinking about mythology, and then in particular via a couple of texts where he placed lots of emphasis on material sources. So looking at the deities in Samothrace, doing philological work. There's also a short note he presented on the Arabic names of Dionysos. So bringing together all this philological and archaeological evidence into a reconstruction of mythology. Has made quite an impression on many thinkers. The late Schelling receptionist history is very complicated. So then you see some authors who've been fascinated by the idea of reality and religion. Kierkegaard is one of them. But also Engels and Bakunin have been attending these lectures, and you can see their ears rising when they hear about reality and a reality beyond our control. So that's part of the immediate reception history. Okay, and then if we go to Heidegger and others, but I'm not going there. That's from Mauro.
Okay, my question is firstly is basically about our present. So, okay, there is nowadays a big discussion about the coming back of irrationalism, especially after the COVID pandemic and the spread also of conspiracy theories. So, I would like to know, how should we define rationality according to Schelling?
So you really are posing the big questions. I really like some of these short phrases I gave you at the very end. So this idea of regaining potentiality. So not assuming things are answered or that we have a decisive answer, but precisely seeing openness as an important achievement and not as a moment of uncertainty or indecision. Because, okay, that being open is a kind of precondition for working towards and carefully assessing any kind of answering strategy you might have. So you could also say that's a two-word summary of the basic predicament of doing scientific research. You could also say regaining potentiality. That's also kind of imperative to be ever and continuously critical in what you do. and this idea of the possibility of being different. In a way that points into the same direction, also has to do with your question. Something can only be genuinely real if it could possibly also have been different. Because that's also kind of indicator of something which is in the end beyond our control. But you see that both of these phrases, about whose context much more could be said, point into the same direction. So you could put it very informally with the idea of keeping an open mind, or more formally by saying rationality is about strategies for, okay, and then I'm returning to this phrase, always keeping your mind open. And okay, that doesn't sound too exciting, because we can, okay, if you do critical theory, that sounds pretty self-evident. But it's interesting in a thinker who's so devoted to a program of philosophizing that started with the idea that we have one closed system, or that we have a philosophy that culminates in revealed religion, to see that you have precisely these imperatives to openness and potentiality in this text.
Attuale. Prego.
Regarding the fact of Zeus, for example, that he gives birth from
a sky, yeah.
I don't remember the name of this, and also the act of eating the sons, and so like to be pregnant. Okay, pregnant. I've noticed that. Especially, I think, feminist theories have like read this kind of stories in terms of the proof that patriarchato, the existence of patriarchato in Greek mythology. And what I'm asking myself now is this an example of what Schelling wanted to push human to think, about new theories, about myths, or is the opposite, like to give something very...
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting question. There are quite some diverging interpretations here. So there are interpretations who are very happy with Schelling emphasizing the role of mother goddesses early on in the philosophy of mythology, but that's too quick, because he there too starts from an originally one god who is productive and active, and whom he naturally identifies with the male gender, and he only then, in a secondary step, is turned into a female mother goddess. So that, at this moment in his story, he's certainly not an emancipating or emancipatory thinker. It's far more interesting what he does with Greek mythology, because he's very eager to collect all the examples in which traditional gender roles and functions do to some extent break down. And so Zeus is an example, Dionysos is an example that he uses again and again. You also have all sorts of the castration of Kronos, quite some stories, but yeah, it's very clear that he doesn't have any kind of feminist or emancipatory agenda here. It's the kind of agenda that he has is arguing against clear-cut functions. And from there we might want to take it into these discourses, but he really doesn't do it himself. And there are all sorts of traces of classical hierarchical ways of thinking still in his text. But in the way, okay, so the kind of answer I gave to the previous question, taking together with his interest in going beyond fixed lines of demarcation, if we combine that, that could be used for emancipatory arguments. Even if it's really not clear whether you have it in his text.
Thank you. I was wondering if I could, or you would accept this reductionist view of your discussion, that when people get together, they have different ideas.
Yeah.
And people see things differently. And things are hidden. For example, before a microscope, a whole world of bacteria was hidden. Before Freud, the unconscious was hidden. And when that gets revealed, there are people who accept it, people who don't accept it. I mean, today we see in democracies concepts like the young man said about facts and fake facts. And we're epistemological. I've never seen American philosophers talk about this, which is interesting. It should be their bread and butter, but it isn't. And so it seems like Schelling is going back and looking at these changes in ideas and seeing how they either meld together or cause wars or transmute into something else, some kind of a compromise where it's possible. And I was wondering if that's a fair description of the process that you were describing.
Okay, now that's yet another huge question. I wanted to say something, reacting to something small you said, but that's okay. It may return to me. Hidden. The interesting thing about Freudian unconscious, of course, is not that that's something that has been hidden up to a certain moment, then it was revealed and became perfectly clear to us. But the point of Freud precisely seems to be that there always are hidden layers to which we, for reasons, complicated reasons, cannot have access, but which still have an impact upon how we live, feel, and think. There's quite some argument whether that's not indeed a good illustration of this point of there are layers in reality that we cannot transparently rationalize, but which we still need to take into account. So Odo Marquardt has famously written about Schelling and psychoanalysis. But one of the things, and that's a kind of strange thing to say for a philosopher, and I'll need to refine what I'm saying in a second. What you could say is what Schelling does in this project is showing but also demarcating the context within which unclarity can be productive and can be important. And maybe that's one of the most important things he learns from mythology, that he can here point to an example of unclarity, perhaps even systematically throughout the tradition of mythology employed unclarity, which precisely by its being unclear has been able to be productive. But the important thing, of course, is that that cannot mean that just be unclear and you'll be productive. That cannot be the message. So we should arrive at pretty clear standards for productive unclarity.
Would you accept this as an example of this kind of unclarity
Okay.
Today can't get.
Now, as a physicist, which I've also studied once, I wouldn't accept that simply because I find quantum mechanics a pretty clear.
No, but the fact that they're being coherent. The fact that, or also the fact that
Yeah.
the fact that in quantum physics you get towards Q where we have to accept notions that are not intuitive. If something here happens, if something on the other side of the universe happens, and that is unexplainable to me. And it's also going further.
Okay. As a working physicist, I would always read quantum mechanics positivistically. I've got very precise experiments and calculations, and the most precise theory we have in physics for making quantitative predictions based on theory and experiments is quantum mechanics. If we have different kinds of frameworks within physical theory, yeah, but that's not the kind of unclarity we have here, because that's a diachronic unclarity or differences, and here we have in the mythological stories, it's in a way both synchronic and diachronic unclarity, and that also seems to be an important complicating factor in these theories.
Christian? Yeah, we're still at 15 minutes.
I have many questions.
That's good.
Maybe I'll restrict myself to 3. Am I allowed to sit?
Yes. Normally we should sit. That is the standard.
That's the standard setup, I thought, so it's really awkward.
I'll take it.
So, yeah, take a pen. So I'm an Arabist and an Islamic studies person, as you may have gathered, but my PhD is actually in religious studies. And I remember taking a course on myth, believe it, in graduate school. And there are these textbook introductions to the study of myth. How do you explain it? How do you interpret it? You know, there's much talk about the relationship between myth and ritual, for example, structuralist interpretations, you name it. I can't remember that Schelling was ever mentioned. And I could be wrong and just, I've forgotten. But I think in the standard introductions to myth and the study of myth that is read by religious studies people, and I'm thinking of Bruce Lincoln's book on the study of myth and other such introductions, Schelling somehow didn't make the cut. And I wonder if you have an inkling why that is. I'm wondering, and here comes the first question, whether it has to do with the fact that he really wrote at a time when it was not possible yet to do a comparative study of mythology. This was the 80s, so he started early, you said, and then the book was written in the 1840s somewhere?
Yeah, he's been lecturing on mythology from the mid-1820s until the early 1850s.
Okay, so
and sort of continuously working towards the
all
body
right.
of work we have.
So in terms of the body of knowledge they had at the time of Egyptian mythology, for example, Champollion, I think, deciphered hieroglyphs not long before. I don't know the exact date, but he's quoting him. But they had just, I think in Europe, one had just begun to study these myths from Egypt. And the same for Zoroastrian myths. Dumézil is a name that comes to mind. I don't know if he interacts, but it's the very early days of building a body of knowledge about the myth of other people. And what he says, indeed, I could relate to your comment very much about Indian mythology. Doesn't make a lot of sense, it seems. So I wonder if there's something difficult and difficult about this historical fact that he couldn't write from a position of real knowledge. And I'm actually interested in him as a man and as a scholar. How can someone at this early point in this development of the study of myth, come up with these enormous theories? And the one term you mentioned was a Weltbewusstsein. How can you speculate about these things if you don't actually know what these myths say? So this is, maybe a hidden critique of Schelling, I don't know, but I'm trying to formulate it as a question. Second question, you were saying repeatedly that he's not interested in teleology. He doesn't want to suggest that we move from more irrational to more rational forms of myth, or from more barbaric, to use another term, from more barbaric to somehow more civilized mythology. And yet, I felt very strongly that there was a kind of hidden teleology. Even the way in which you were talking about the early steps of Sabian mythology. So this is when monotheism, with which he starts, develops into an astral cult. I think you were saying this was some kind of, you said this is a first step in his theorizing about mythology. Then later on, when you get to the Elysian mysteries, you said this is for him the ultimate of mythology, because Christianity is close around the corner. So he never doesn't seem to say explicitly that he's against teleology. Is there a hidden teleology that maybe he wasn't aware of himself? And then finally, and to say something nice about him, the stuff about, it's all about having the potential. And that is the ultimate achievement. That somehow sounds very pleasantly postmodern to me. It's almost Derrida. So I like that, and I was thinking of not of Derrida, but actually of Lévi-Strauss, strangely, who has this idea that myth is a form of pensée sauvage. He says it's a wild form of thinking. It's a different modality of reasoning, and I could see that kind of very modern argument going back to Schelling and trying to make a connection. So I wonder if there is one.
Okay. Sorry. Questions don't get smaller the longer the evening. Sources, yes, you're perfect. He is quoting all the names you've been referring to, so he really is trying to be up to date with the literature of his times. It's very difficult to judge from the body of text we have to which extent he was being able to make an expert judgment as to the state of the research in the field. It's also remarkable that the most important author for him, source author basically for all of these religions, is Herodotus. So him he's quoting throughout, also on the Persians and on Indian mythology. And that, of course, is a deeply complicated, deeply troubling way of dealing with sources. So he clearly had to work in a situation with some advanced modern scholarship and a large body that he knew very well indeed, but which of course is very difficult to, it certainly is not a neutral kind of account, in particular if we want to complicate a story that includes both Eastern and Greek mythologies. I agree completely. What he did is, and that's one of the most fascinating texts, is the short text on the Kiberian gods and Samotraki, which is a 25 pages text with 100 whatsoever pages of footnotes, where he really exaggerated in terms of giving scholarly evidence for basically every single sentence. He said, making use of an enormous variety of sources from all sorts of languages. But not a lot of them being contemporary sources, so lots of ancient body of work. So in a way, that's a kind of showing off that I, the philosopher, have full command of the available sources, and I'm still able to build big theories on this basis. So that's the kind of attitude how he presented himself. And that may be strongly exaggerating his capabilities or the state of research. He certainly tried to show that he's deeply into the philological and historical sources. And there are some comments about Dumézil, Champollion doing something really new, but he's not really saying, only now can we start to get a first inkling of what it was. Yes, the second point, so I've been constantly struggling with this problem, that there is a clear development, and he's of course telling this story as a kind of sequence of steps, of course leading up to the Greeks. But there also are all sorts of deconstructing, or elements deconstructing this narrative. So he has some steps of Greek mythology first, and then comes Indian, and then he's returning to the Greeks, and he's also something on the Greeks in the introduction. And he has figures such as Dionysos, who come up everywhere on all stages of the story. So yes, there clearly is, if we want to talk in terms of teleology, an implicit teleology. That's the most common misprint in Kant. Yeah, in the first editions of Kant's works, that continuously theology and teleology get mixed up in terms of misprints between brackets. But there also are quite some explicit strategies to deconstruct all too straightforward linear developments. And he also has the strong claim that it's only the totality of the development that can account for mythology. So this can, and the reception, Lévi-Strauss, yeah, okay, yeah, nice. Good. Part of the, that's one of the traditional difficulties we have with structuralist interpretations, that they can seem to be abstractively formalizing things. And that's something he would strongly oppose. So even the most abstract patterns of thinking need to be concretely, individually present in historical, mythological figures. So that would be the first sentence he would say if you were to present him with a Lévi-Straussian reading of myth.
Thank you.
I presume.
Just to follow up to Christian. In italiano, così cambiamo un po'. Poi se non capisci lo dico in inglese. Perché anch'io ero colpito da questo problema della hidden teleology, però forse non c'è tanto una teleologia, perché non c'è una vera storia, un vero progresso che dà la molteplicità. Sembra piuttosto che ci sia una variazione continua sul tema della relazione unità-molteplicità, e quindi piuttosto come Lévi-Strauss, cioè non c'è. Il problema, diciamo, è che alla fine il cristianesimo e la mitologia greca non è che sono il completamento, quindi il telos di un percorso, ma sono il punto di riferimento in cui in qualche modo da cui giudicare tutto il resto. Quindi c'è comunque una implicita priorità della mitologia greca, ancora di più del cristianesimo, però non c'è una storia, c'è semplicemente, come dire, un tentativo di mappare tutto questo gioco di relazioni tra pluralità e unità, non lo so.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. I'm trying to answer in English. That's indeed one of the functions that these, in particular Greek mythology, has for him, and that's to serve as a standard for complexity. And then we cannot really talk in terms of a story leading up to them, but then we can, and yeah, that's a kind of Lévi-Straussian idea again, make use of this complexity in order to discuss other and earlier forms of mythology. Yes. We can, and that's also something he does in a number of places, where he says, look, there should be something like this or that in other forms of mythology, and maybe we can find this, so there should be a mediating figure basically everywhere. And can't we interpret this mythological figure as having this kind of function? So that would be a very clear illustration of this, the structure you have in mind.
Sì, perché poi sul tema generale dell'incontro, di questi tre incontri, uno vede che c'è un rapporto particolare col mondo greco, perché da un lato, come dire, l'opposizione Occidente-Oriente, Grecia, quando parli dell'Occidente poi parli della Grecia, non è che parli dei francesi, l'opposizione, per i tedeschi. L'opposizione Grecia-Oriente in qualche modo è contestata alla radice, perché è un'altra versione del mito, quindi non c'è il mito razionale greco contro il mito ebraico, no, tutte variazioni sul tema del mito, quindi da un certo punto di vista va contro l'opposizione, ma dall'altro punto di vista di fatto implicitamente riconosce la superiorità della Grecia, perché il mito greco è la versione più funzionale, quindi insomma ne sappiamo.
It's really interesting to see how, and that's something which I also said earlier in one of the answers, so this kind of moving at a tipping point between. So, variazione sul tema. Okay, that's a very nice way of putting it, but then of course the question is, where does the tema come from? And here it's clear that in Schelling's presentation it's not really clear. It's the kind of, I would like to be a composer, but I'm not. So you've got a simple version of the thema, and that's the transition from an original monotheism into polytheistic systems. And you have a far richer version of, is it the same theme? And that's the complexity of the Greek mythological cosmos. And somewhere in between these two themes, mythology unfolds. But put like that, that clearly sounds indeed like a very, very strong implicit, perhaps not teleology, but positing of standards. Even if he has all these strategies for going beyond it. And even then, I would be reluctant to talk in terms of opposition. So there are all sorts of structures that he cannot get rid of, perhaps even does not want, but it cannot. But one thing he clearly does, and that's talk in terms of oppositions.
Yes.
Just one quick question. Is there mythology, according to Schelling, in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism?
He's saying surprisingly little about Islam. Sorry?
I don't blame him.
Just
Christianity.
Yeah. It reads pretty much like what he does in mythology, but now he calls it religion. So this kind of step from mythology to religion seems to be important for him. And that's something I didn't talk about. I have one or two sentences about that. And he's building in quite a lot of Judaist traditions into Christianity. So he's really taking the Old and the New Testament together here. But that really would be perhaps not a different, but another story to tell.
Ok, va bene, allora ancora grazie a Paolo per
Grazie per tutte le vostre questioni e domande.
discussione interessante. Ci aggiorniamo domani alle 4 con la seconda relazione di questo ciclo di incontri. Grazie a tutti.